Maya Robinson stood at the edge of the Chicago Trust Bank boardroom, her heart pounding against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The mahogany table stretched before her like a judicial bench, and the 12 faces staring back held the cold indifference of executioners. CFO Robert Sterling's voice cut through the air with surgical precision. "You don't belong here anymore, Maya." The words hung in the silence like smoke from a funeral pyre. 8 years of building this institution from a struggling regional bank into a financial powerhouse. And this was how it ended. Not with gratitude or respect, but with a calculated assassination of her character disguised as corporate restructuring. "The board has voted," COO Margaret Walsh continued, her manicured fingers sliding a termination letter across the polished surface. "You're no longer suitable for our company culture." Maya's fingers traced the edges of her leather portfolio, feeling the weight of documents inside that would soon change everything. She had spent 3 months preparing for this moment, gathering evidence like a detective, building a case that would shake the very foundations of corporate America. Her dark eyes swept across the room, memorizing each face, each smirk of satisfaction, each barely concealed sneer of triumph. "I understand," she said quietly, her voice carrying the dangerous calm of a gathering storm. A smile played at the corners of her mouth, not of defeat, but of anticipation. "Thank you for showing me exactly who you really are." As she stood to leave, Maya knew that these 12 people had just made the most catastrophic mistake of their careers. They thought they were burying her, but they were actually planting the seeds of their own destruction. You won't believe what Maya had been preparing for the past 3 months. 6 months earlier, Maya had returned from her medical leave with the quiet confidence of someone who had stared mortality in the face and emerged victorious. The cancer treatments had taken their toll, her once full figure now lean, her signature power suits replaced with simple blazers that hung loose on her smaller frame. But her mind remained sharp as a blade, honed by months of reflection and renewed purpose. The elevator doors opened to the executive floor, and Maya stepped out carrying only a worn leather briefcase and a coffee cup from the lobby cafe. No designer handbag, no jewelry that screamed wealth, nothing that immediately identified her as the woman who had transformed Chicago Trust from a failing institution into a billion-dollar success story. Jennifer Martinez, the new receptionist, looked up from her computer with the practiced smile of someone trained to gatekeep access to power. Her eyes quickly assessed Maya's appearance. The simple navy blazer, the absence of obvious status symbols, and her expression shifted to one of polite dismissal. "Excuse me, do you have an appointment? I don't see your name on today's schedule," Jennifer said, her tone carrying the subtle condescension reserved for those deemed unimportant. "This is my office," Maya replied gently, gesturing toward the corner suite that bore her nameplate. "I'm Dr. Maya Robinson." Jennifer's laugh was short and sharp. "Oh, you work in maintenance? The service elevators are around the corner. The executive restrooms are off limits to—" "I'm the CEO," Maya interrupted softly. The words seemed to bounce off Jennifer like rain on concrete. The young woman's expression remained unchanged, as if Maya had claimed to be the Queen of England. "Right. Well, if you're looking for work, HR is on the 3rd floor. They might have openings in housekeeping." Maya nodded slowly, filing away the interaction in her mental database. She had experienced subtle discrimination before, but this brazen dismissal was something new. Or perhaps it wasn't new. Perhaps she had simply been insulated by the trappings of power for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to be judged solely by appearance. The elevator ride to her floor felt longer than usual. When the doors opened, she nearly collided with David Chen, the marketing director, who was rushing toward the conference room with an armload of presentation materials. "Whoa, sorry about that," he said, then stopped short when he registered her presence. Wait, who are you? How did you get access to this floor? I work here, David. It's Maya. David's eyes narrowed as he studied her face, clearly struggling to reconcile the woman before him with his mental image of his CEO. Maya. Maya Robinson? His voice carried the incredulity of someone who had discovered their neighbor was actually a celebrity. You look different. Cancer treatment will do that, she said simply. The word cancer seemed to activate some protective protocol in David's brain, and his expression shifted to one of uncomfortable sympathy mixed with obvious doubt. Oh, wow. I didn't know you were… are you sure you should be back? Maybe you need more time to recover? The subtext was clear. You don't look like a CEO anymore. You look like someone who's been broken by illness, diminished, weakened. You look like someone who might not have the strength to lead a major financial institution. Maya watched the calculations happening behind David's eyes and felt a familiar tightness in her chest. Not the physical pain of treatment, but the emotional ache of being seen as less than she was. I'm feeling much better, thank you. Shall we discuss the quarterly projections this afternoon? Sure, David said, already backing away. Maybe Margaret should handle the heavy lifting for a while. You know, until you're really back to your old self. As he disappeared into the conference room, Maya stood alone in the hallway, feeling the weight of their brief interaction. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and she could already sense them taking root in the minds of her colleagues. She was no longer Maya Robinson, the visionary who had saved Chicago Trust. She was Maya Robinson, the cancer survivor who might not be strong enough to lead. The Monday morning executive meeting felt like entering a parallel universe where Maya had become invisible. She sat in her usual chair at the head of the conference table, but the conversation flowed around her as if she were a piece of furniture, present but irrelevant to the business at hand. Robert Sterling dominated the discussion with his usual commanding presence, his silver hair and tailored suits projecting the kind of old money authority that opened doors and commanded respect. At 55, he had the look of someone born to lead. If leadership were measured by the confidence to speak loudly and the privilege to be heard without question. As I was saying before Maya joined us, Sterling began, the phrase itself a subtle erasure of her presence. We need to address some concerning trends in our decision-making process. The board has expressed reservations about certain strategic directions. Maya opened her portfolio and removed her prepared agenda, but Sterling continued without acknowledging her input. Margaret Walsh, impeccably groomed and radiating the kind of corporate competence that came with decades of navigating boardroom politics, nodded in agreement. The numbers don't lie, Walsh added, sliding a folder across the table that conspicuously bypassed Maya. Our traditional client base has expressed concerns about the bank's recent cultural shifts. Some of our longest-standing customers are questioning whether Chicago Trust still represents their values. Maya felt the words like small cuts, each one precisely placed to draw blood without leaving obvious wounds. She cleared her throat gently. Could you be more specific about which strategic decisions are causing concern? I'd like to review the data behind these claims. Sterling's smile was patronizing, the kind reserved for a child who had interrupted adult conversation. Maya, I think what Margaret is trying to say is that leadership requires a certain gravitas. Our clients come from established families, people who value stability and traditional approaches to wealth management. They need to feel confident in the people handling their money. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Maya felt the familiar sensation of being studied, measured, and found wanting, not for her track record or her vision, but for something far more fundamental and unchangeable. Our client satisfaction scores are at an all-time high, Maya said quietly, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. Our profit margins have increased by 37% since I took over as CEO, Our community investment programs have earned recognition from the Federal Reserve. I'm not sure which metrics you're using to measure leadership effectiveness. Walsh leaned forward, her expression one of concerned mentorship. Maya, no one is questioning your dedication. But leadership is about more than numbers. It's about presence, about inspiring confidence. Some of our stakeholders have wondered whether the stress of your recent health challenges might have affected your judgment. Maya's pen moved steadily across her legal pad, documenting each word, each inflection, each careful pause designed to wound. Her phone, positioned discreetly beside her notebook, captured every syllable of the conversation. She had learned from the best trial lawyers in Chicago that the most damaging evidence came from people who thought they were speaking in private. I see, Maya said. And who specifically has raised these concerns? I'd like to address them directly. Sterling's laugh was hearty and dismissive. Maya, you know we can't reveal confidential board discussions, but I think the message is clear. We all want what's best for Chicago Trust. Sometimes that means making difficult decisions about leadership succession. The words leadership succession hung in the air like a death sentence. Maya looked around the table at faces that had once sought her approval, her vision, her guidance. Now they looked at her with the mixture of pity and impatience usually reserved for elderly relatives who had overstayed their welcome. She reached for her phone and sent a quick text to her attorney. Meeting in progress. Documentation ongoing. Prepare Phase 2. The response came back immediately. Standing by. You're stronger than they know. Maya smiled. Not the broken smile of someone accepting defeat, but the quiet confidence of someone who had been underestimated their entire career and had learned to turn that underestimation into a weapon. The termination meeting was scheduled for a Friday afternoon, when the executive floor would be mostly empty and the chances of witnesses would be minimal. Maya arrived 5 minutes early, carrying the same worn leather briefcase she had brought to every important meeting for the past 8 years. Inside were her termination letter, her resignation speech, and something else. 3 months of meticulously gathered evidence that would soon reshape the landscape of corporate accountability. The boardroom felt colder than usual, the late autumn light filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the mahogany table. 12 faces stared back at her with the kind of professional detachment usually reserved for hostile takeovers or bankruptcy proceedings. Sterling rose from his chair with the theatrical gravity of a judge delivering a verdict. Maya, thank you for coming. This isn't easy for any of us, but the board has reached a unanimous decision regarding your continued employment with Chicago Trust. Maya sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression revealing nothing. She had practiced this moment in her mirror for weeks, learning to control every micro-expression, every involuntary response that might betray the storm building inside her. After careful consideration, Walsh continued, her voice dripping with false sympathy, we've determined that your leadership style is no longer aligned with the bank's strategic vision. The board feels that a change in executive leadership is necessary to maintain client confidence and institutional stability. Maya's phone vibrated gently against her thigh, a text from her legal team confirming that the live stream was active and recording. 30,000 people around the world were about to witness the systematic destruction of a black woman's career, broadcast in real time to an audience hungry for justice. We understand this is difficult, Sterling said, sliding the termination letter across the table with the casual indifference of someone ordering lunch. But the board has serious concerns about your ability to represent Chicago Trust's values. Our clients come from traditional backgrounds, old Chicago families who built this city. They need leadership that reflects their priorities and understanding of financial stewardship. The words hit Maya like physical blows, each phrase carefully chosen to inflict maximum damage while maintaining plausible deniability. Traditional backgrounds, old Chicago families. Understanding of financial stewardship. The coded language of discrimination. polished to a high shine by decades of practice. Board member Harrison Blackwood, a man whose family had owned Chicago real estate since before the Great Fire, leaned forward with the expression of someone delivering unwelcome but necessary medicine. "Maya, we all admire your energy and your efforts to modernize our approach. But Chicago Trust has served the same families for generations. They expect a certain gravitas from their financial leadership." Maya felt her jaw clench involuntarily. Gravitas. The word that meant, you don't look like us, therefore you can't lead us. The word that erased 8 years of unprecedented growth, innovation, and profitability with a single syllable. Your recent health challenges have also raised questions about your long-term viability. Walsh added, her tone suggesting deep concern, while her eyes remained cold as winter lake ice. The board feels that the stress of executive leadership might be counterproductive to your recovery. Maya's hand moved to her phone, sending a predetermined signal to her legal team. Across the city, 5 of the most powerful civil rights attorneys in America received a single word via encrypted message. Now. "I understand," Maya said quietly, her voice carrying the dangerous calm of someone who had been pushed to their breaking point and had chosen not to break. "You're terminating me because I don't fit your vision of what leadership should look like." "Now, Maya, that's not—" Sterling began. "Because I'm a black woman who dared to believe that competence and results mattered more than bloodlines and country club memberships." Maya continued, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Because I transformed a dying institution into a billion-dollar success story, and that success made some people very uncomfortable." The room erupted in nervous denials and defensive protestations, but Maya was no longer listening. She stood slowly, gathering her briefcase and looking each board member in the eye with the intensity of someone memorizing faces for future reference. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for showing me exactly what you think of people like me. It's been illuminating." As she walked towards the door, Maya felt the weight of history on her shoulders. Not just her own history, but the history of every black woman who had been told she didn't belong, every professional who had been diminished by prejudice disguised as policy. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about changing a system that had operated in shadows for too long. These procedures seemed designed to target one specific demographic. But did they have any idea who they were really dealing with? The news of Maya's termination spread through Chicago's financial district like wildfire through dry grass. Within hours of the board meeting, the story had jumped from internal company communication to industry gossip to local news headlines. "Chicago Trust terminates first black CEO" appeared on the Tribune's website at 6:47 p.m., followed by a cascade of social media reactions that would eventually reshape the narrative around corporate accountability. Maya's first move was not what anyone expected. Instead of hiring a publicist or calling a press conference, she activated her dormant TikTok account and went live from her downtown apartment. The video opened with her sitting at her kitchen table, still wearing the navy blazer from her termination meeting, looking directly into the camera with the kind of quiet intensity that commands attention. "Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Maya Robinson, and until 4 hours ago, I was the CEO of Chicago Trust Bank," she began, her voice steady and conversational. "I want to tell you what just happened to me, because I think it's important that people understand how discrimination works in corporate America." The viewer count climbed steadily as Maya recounted the events of the past 6 months, the subtle dismissals, the coded language, the systematic erosion of her authority. She spoke without notes, without preparation, just one woman telling her truth to anyone willing to listen. By the time she finished, 43,000 people had tuned in, and the comment section was a river of rage and solidarity. Sterling and Walsh first learned about the live stream from their respective spouses, who had been tagged in the video by friends and colleagues. Sterling's initial reaction was dismissive. Who cared what a terminated employee said on social media? But when his phone started ringing with calls from board members, major clients, and industry reporters, the reality of the situation began to crystallize. "She's gone viral," Walsh said during an emergency conference call that included the entire board. The video has been shared over 10,000 times in 6 hours. People are calling for boycotts. The .com Chicago Trust discrimination hashtag is trending nationally. The second escalation came 24 hours later, when Maya held a press conference outside the bank's headquarters. She had spent the night fielding calls from civil rights organizations, employment attorneys, and media outlets from across the country. When she emerged from the building at 2 p.m., she faced a crowd of over 200 people. Bank employees, community activists, local politicians, and concerned citizens who had driven downtown to show their support. "Yesterday, I was told that I don't represent Chicago Trust's values," Maya said into a microphone that broadcast her words to a crowd that had swelled to fill the entire block. "I was told that my leadership style, successful as it has been, doesn't fit with their vision of what a CEO should look like. I was told that my recent health challenges made me unsuitable for executive leadership." The crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Shouts of "shame" and "justice for Maya" echoed off the surrounding buildings. News helicopters circled overhead, and the live stream of the press conference was being watched by over 500,000 people. But it was the third escalation that truly changed everything. On Sunday morning, Maya published a detailed thread on Twitter that included screenshots of emails, excerpts from recorded conversations, and a timeline of discriminatory actions that painted a damning picture of institutional bias. The thread was retweeted over 100,000 times in the first hour, with responses from celebrities, politicians, and business leaders expressing outrage and solidarity. Sterling and Walsh found themselves in full crisis mode, hiring expensive public relations firms and legal teams to contain the damage. But every statement they released seemed to make things worse. Sterling's appearance on Bloomberg TV, where he insisted that Maya's termination was purely about performance, backfired spectacularly when Bloomberg's producers played audio clips from Maya's recorded board meetings that contradicted his claims. "We're dealing with a coordinated attack on this institution," Sterling told the Chicago Business Journal in a phone interview that would later be cited as evidence in federal discrimination proceedings. "Maya Robinson is a disgruntled employee who's trying to weaponize identity politics to cover for her own failures. The interview was a strategic disaster. Within hours, weaponize identity politics was trending on social media, with thousands of people sharing their own stories of workplace discrimination. Maya's legal team, which had been quietly building their case for months, announced that they were filing federal discrimination charges and considering a class action lawsuit on behalf of other Chicago Trust employees who had experienced similar treatment. The final escalation came when Maya's story caught the attention of federal regulators. The Office of the Comptroller of the Currency announced that it was opening an investigation into Chicago Trust's employment practices, and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission confirmed that it was reviewing multiple complaints filed against the bank. Maya watched the chaos unfold from her apartment, surrounded by legal documents and evidence that she had been collecting for months. She had known that her termination would create ripples, but she hadn't anticipated the tsunami that followed. Every news cycle brought new revelations, new voices speaking out, new pressure on Chicago Trust's leadership. Her phone rang constantly. Interview requests, legal consultations, messages of support from strangers around the world. But the call that mattered most came on Monday morning from Jonathan Pierce, a partner at one of Washington, D.C.'s most prestigious civil rights law firms. "Maya," he said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never lost a case. "We're ready to show Chicago Trust what real power looks like. Are you ready to change the system?" Maya looked out her window at the crowd of protesters that had been gathering outside Chicago Trust's headquarters for 3 days straight. Signs reading, "Justice for Maya" and "End Corporate Discrimination" filled the sidewalk, held by people who had never met her, but understood that her fight was their fight too. "I've been ready for months," she said quietly. "Let's do this." The emergency shareholders meeting was called for Tuesday morning, ostensibly to address the public relations crisis surrounding Maya's termination. Sterling had spent the weekend orchestrating a careful narrative. Maya was a disgruntled employee making false accusations. The bank's leadership remained strong and unified, and the whole situation would blow over once the media found their next story. The Chicago Trust boardroom was packed beyond capacity, with shareholders, journalists, and interested parties filling every seat and lining the walls. Sterling stood at the podium with the confidence of someone who had weathered corporate storms before, his silver hair perfectly styled, his navy suit conveying authority and control. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming on such short notice," he began, his voice carrying across the hushed room. "I want to address the recent unpleasantness surrounding the departure of our former CEO. While we respect Dr. Robinson's contributions to this institution, the board stands behind its decision to pursue new leadership that better aligns with Chicago Trust's traditional values and long-term strategic vision." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several shareholders shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but Sterling pressed on, apparently oblivious to the tension building in the room. "The allegations being made against this institution are without merit," he continued. "Chicago Trust has always operated with the highest standards of professional conduct. Any suggestion that race or gender played a role in our personnel decisions is simply—" The boardroom doors opened with a sharp bang that echoed through the space like a gunshot. Every head turned as Maya Robinson entered the room. But this was not the diminished woman who had been escorted out 3 days earlier. She wore a charcoal grey power suit that fit her perfectly, her hair styled in elegant locks that framed her face, her bearing radiating the kind of confidence that comes from holding all the cards in a high-stakes game. Behind her walked 5 men and women in matching black suits, each carrying identical leather briefcases and wearing expressions of lethal professionalism. The legal team moved through the crowd like sharks through water, their presence changing the entire energy of the room. Maya walked directly to the front of the room, her heels clicking against the marble floor with metronome precision. Sterling's mouth hung open mid-sentence, his prepared remarks forgotten as he watched his former employee transform the space simply by entering it. "Excuse me," Sterling managed, his voice cracking slightly. "This is a closed shareholders meeting. Security should have. Dr. Robinson is the largest individual shareholder in this institution," said the woman to Maya's right, her voice cutting through Sterling's protest like a blade through paper. "Jennifer Chen, federal civil rights attorney. Dr. Robinson has every legal right to address this meeting." Maya stepped up to the microphone, and the room fell completely silent. She looked out at the sea of faces, some hostile, some curious, some openly supportive, and smiled the kind of smile that had once terrorized opposing counsel in federal court. "Hello, everyone," she said, her voice carrying easily through the sound system. "For those who don't know me, I'm Dr. Maya Robinson. I held a PhD in economics from Harvard, spent 15 years as a federal prosecutor specializing in financial crimes, and for the past 8 years, I've served as CEO of Chicago Trust Bank, a position from which I was illegally terminated this past Friday." The word illegally hung in the air like a challenge. Sterling started to object, but Maya raised her hand with the authority of someone accustomed to controlling courtrooms. "Mr. Sterling, you're about to learn something very important about the law," Maya continued, her tone conversational but edged with steel. "When you terminate someone for discriminatory reasons and then lie about it in public, you commit several federal crimes, When you do it to someone who spent 15 years prosecuting those exact same crimes, you make a very serious mistake. Maya's lead attorney stepped forward and connected a laptop to the room's projection system. The large screen behind Maya filled with an official-looking document bearing the seal of the U.S. Department of Justice. This morning, the FBI executed search warrants at Chicago Trust's headquarters and the personal residences of 3 board members, Maya announced, her voice steady as she delivered what amounted to a death sentence for Sterling's career. They were looking for evidence of systematic employment discrimination, mail fraud, and civil rights violations. I'm pleased to report that they found everything they were looking for. The room erupted in chaos. Shareholders jumped to their feet, shouting questions and demands for explanations. Journalists frantically typed notes and called their editors. Board members huddled together in panicked whispers, their faces pale with shock and fear. But Maya wasn't finished. She waited for the noise to subside, then activated a recording that filled the room with Sterling's voice from the previous Friday's board meeting. Our clients come from traditional backgrounds, old Chicago families who built this city. They need leadership that reflects their priorities and understanding of financial stewardship. The recording continued for 3 minutes, capturing every discriminatory comment, every coded phrase, every moment of casual racism that the board had thought was private. When it ended, the silence was deafening. For the past 3 months, I've been working with federal investigators to document the systematic discrimination at this institution, Maya said, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who had just detonated a nuclear bomb in the middle of corporate America. The evidence includes over 40 hours of recorded conversations, hundreds of emails, and testimony from dozens of current and former employees who have experienced similar treatment. Sterling's face had gone from confident pink to ashen grey. Walsh sat frozen in her chair, staring at Maya as if she were seeing a ghost. The other board members looked like passengers on a sinking ship, desperately searching for lifeboats that didn't exist. Maya's final revelation came when she activated the room's video system and connected to a live feed from Washington, D.C. The screen filled with the image of a federal courthouse where protesters had gathered outside the building, holding signs reading, "Justice for Maya" and "End Corporate Discrimination." In approximately 30 minutes, Maya announced, the U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois will hold a press conference announcing federal criminal charges against Chicago Trust Bank and several of its executives. The charges include conspiracy to violate civil rights, mail fraud, and obstruction of justice. The room fell silent as the full scope of Maya's counterattack became clear. This wasn't just about her termination. This was about dismantling an entire system of institutional discrimination, one federal crime at a time. Maya looked directly at Sterling, who seemed to shrink under her gaze. "You thought you were firing a cancer survivor who had lost her edge," she said quietly. "What you actually did was attack a federal prosecutor who had spent 15 years learning exactly how to destroy people like you. The federal courthouse in downtown Chicago had never seen anything quite like the scene that unfolded on Wednesday morning. Media trucks lined the street for 3 blocks in each direction, their satellite dishes pointing skyward like flowers turning toward the sun. Protesters filled Federal Plaza, their chants of "Justice for Maya" echoing off the surrounding buildings and reverberating through the canyons of downtown Chicago. Inside the courthouse, U.S. Attorney Patricia Williams stood at the podium in the main press room, surrounded by FBI agents, civil rights investigators, and federal prosecutors. The charges she was about to announce would send shockwaves through corporate America and establish new precedents for how discrimination cases would be prosecuted in the federal system. Today, a federal grand jury has returned indictments against Chicago Trust Bank and 3 of its senior executives, Williams announced, her voice carrying the weight of institutional authority. The charges include conspiracy to violate civil rights under federal law, mail fraud, wire fraud, and obstruction of justice. This represents one of the most comprehensive civil rights prosecutions ever brought against a major financial institution. The first domino fell within minutes of Williams' announcement. Robert Sterling, who had spent the night huddled with his legal team, was arrested at his Lake Forest mansion by FBI agents who had been waiting outside since dawn. The footage of Sterling being led away in handcuffs, broadcast live on every major news network, became an instant symbol of corporate accountability. Margaret Walsh turned herself in to federal authorities at 3 p.m., accompanied by her attorney and wearing dark sunglasses that couldn't hide the devastation on her face. Her resignation letter, submitted to the board via email, was a masterpiece of legal self-preservation. Due to recent events and my desire to focus on personal matters, I am resigning my position effective immediately. But it was Harrison Blackwood's arrest that truly captured the public imagination. The 73-year-old scion of one of Chicago's most prominent families was taken into custody outside the Union League Club, where he had been attending a hastily called meeting of the city's business elite. The symbolism was perfect. Old money and old power finally being held accountable for the discrimination they had practiced for generations. Chicago Trust Bank itself faced immediate regulatory action that threatened its very existence. The Office of the Comptroller of the Currency imposed a $50 million fine and required the bank to submit to federal oversight of all hiring and promotion decisions. The Federal Reserve launched its own investigation into the bank's lending practices, focusing on whether discriminatory hiring had led to discriminatory lending. Maya watched the collapse unfold from the law offices of Chen, Pierce and Associates, surrounded by legal documents and evidence boxes that represented 3 months of meticulous investigation. Her phone buzzed constantly with interview requests, speaking invitations, and messages of support from around the world. Justice for Maya had become more than a hashtag. It had become a rallying cry for workplace equality. The civil lawsuit that Maya's team filed simultaneously with the criminal charges was even more devastating than the federal prosecution. The complaint, running over 200 pages, detailed a pattern of discrimination that went back decades. Employee after employee came forward with stories of being passed over for promotion, excluded from important meetings, or subjected to subtle but systematic bias. The discovery process revealed emails that were even more damaging than the recorded conversations. Sterling's private messages to other executives included phrases like cultural fit concerns and maintaining institutional character, corporate euphemisms for racial discrimination that would have been comic if they weren't so destructive. But perhaps the most satisfying moment for Maya came when the bank's board of directors voted unanimously to offer her a public apology and reinstatement as CEO. The vote took place during an emergency meeting held via video conference, with most board members participating from their lawyers' offices or, in Sterling's case, from federal detention. The apology itself was read by interim chairman David Morrison, a mild-mannered man who had joined the board only 6 months earlier and had been horrified to discover the discrimination that had been normalized within the institution. On behalf of Chicago Trust Bank, I want to offer Dr. Maya Robinson our sincerest apologies for the discrimination and illegal treatment she experienced. Morrison read, his voice heavy with shame. The actions of former executives do not represent the values we aspire to embody. We ask Dr. Robinson to consider returning to lead this institution forward into a new era of equality and justice. Maya's response was broadcast live on social media, watched by over 2 million people who had been following her story since the original TikTok video. She sat in the same kitchen where she had first told her story, wearing the same navy blazer. But everything else had changed. The woman on screen radiated power and confidence, someone who had stared down institutional racism and emerged victorious. "I accept Chicago Trust's apology," she said simply. "More importantly, I accept their offer to return as CEO, because this fight was never just about me. It was about changing a system that has operated in the shadows for too long. Chicago Trust will become a model for what corporate America can look like when it chooses justice over tradition, merit over prejudice. The announcement sent Chicago Trust's stock price soaring and triggered a wave of similar investigations at financial institutions across the country. Maya had not just won her individual case, she had fundamentally altered the landscape of corporate accountability in America. 3 months after her reinstatement, Maya sat in her corner office overlooking Lake Michigan, the late afternoon sun casting golden light across the Chicago skyline. The office had been completely renovated during her absence, the old boys' club atmosphere replaced with artwork celebrating diversity and achievement, the walls lined with awards recognizing Chicago Trust's transformation into a model of inclusive leadership. The changes went far beyond decoration. Under Maya's renewed leadership, Chicago Trust had implemented the most comprehensive diversity and inclusion program in the financial services industry. Every hiring decision was reviewed by a diverse panel, every promotion was evaluated for potential bias, and every policy was examined through the lens of equality and fairness. The results had been remarkable. Employee satisfaction scores reached all-time highs as workers who had felt marginalized and overlooked suddenly found themselves valued and heard. Client satisfaction improved as the bank's customer service reflected the diversity of the communities it served. Even the bottom line benefited. Chicago Trust's profits increased by 23% in Maya's first quarter back, as customers chose to do business with an institution that aligned with their values. Maya's daily video blog, Truth and Power, had become required viewing for business leaders across the country. In today's episode, she reflected on the lessons learned from her journey through corporate discrimination and federal prosecution. 6 months ago, I thought I was dying, she said, looking directly into the camera with the same intensity that had captivated millions of viewers. The cancer was gone, but I felt like my career was over, like everything I had built was crumbling around me. I didn't realize that sometimes you have to be completely broken down before you can rebuild yourself into something stronger. She paused, organizing her thoughts with the precision of someone who had learned that words carry weight and consequences. The people who tried to destroy me made a fundamental mistake. They assumed that because I looked different, because I had been weakened by illness, because I didn't fit their narrow definition of leadership, I must be vulnerable. They forgot that real strength doesn't come from privilege or tradition. It comes from knowing who you are and refusing to let anyone diminish that truth. Maya's message had resonated far beyond the corporate world. She received letters from teachers, nurses, construction workers, and students, people who had faced their own versions of discrimination and found inspiration in her refusal to accept injustice. Her story had become a blueprint for fighting back against institutional bias, a roadmap for transforming pain into power. Change is never easy, she continued, but it's always possible. The systems that seem permanent, the attitudes that feel unchangeable, the barriers that appear insurmountable, all of these can be overcome by people who refuse to accept that this is just how things are. Every voice matters. Every story has power. Every person who stands up for justice makes it easier for the next person to do the same. The video ended with Maya looking out her office window at the bustling city below, where thousands of people were starting their own fights against discrimination, inspired by a black woman who had refused to be silenced. The future belongs to all of us, she said quietly, but only if we're brave enough to claim it. Maya's final message came not from her executive office or a formal press conference, but from the same kitchen table where she had first shared her story with the world. The video was simple, unpolished, intimate, just one woman speaking directly to anyone who needed to hear her words. If you're watching this, chances are you've faced your own version of what happened to me, she said, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who understood struggle firsthand. Maybe you've been told you don't belong, that you're not leadership material, that you should be grateful for whatever crumbs of opportunity come your way. I want you to know something. They're wrong." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes intense with conviction. "You are more powerful than they want you to believe. You have more rights than they want you to know. You deserve more respect than they're willing to give. And if you're ready to fight for justice, not just for yourself, but for everyone who comes after you, then you're not alone in that fight." Maya held up her phone, showing the screen to the camera. Like this video if you believe that discrimination has no place in any workplace. Share it if you think other people need to hear this message. Subscribe if you want to be part of a community that refuses to accept injustice as inevitable. Her smile was radiant, triumphant, the expression of someone who had stared down the most powerful forces in corporate America and emerged victorious. And remember, they thought they were destroying one black woman who had lost her edge. What they actually did was awaken an entire movement of people who refuse to be silent anymore. Your voice matters. Your story has power. Your courage can change everything. The video ended with text overlaying Maya's smiling face. Justice isn't just a concept, it's a choice. What's yours?